Okay, this time I used my starting button and it now says live, but it still says broadcast rather than stop on my iTV. So I'm learning a good deal about this setting up and getting going, and maybe a few more practice sessions like this one, and I'll be more accomplished at getting my live streams going. I'm looking forward to converting over from video units to the Teradek Cube encoder, and it should be able to send to Facebook and YouTube in a more precise way. So to repeat, the iTV app running on my iPad is still saying broadcast, but it also says live, which is a bit of a contradiction. The broadcast button hasn't changed over to now saying stop, to stop the broadcast, whereas Facebook's video app is telling me they are live, and the stop button is blinking in case I want to stop the program. Same for my iFi. Which says it's live, and yet the screens are not counting down, and it doesn't seem clear that they are seeing my program. So we'll learn after we've completed this one whether this is happening again. I'll walk away for another minute and try to kickstart my backhaul screen. Okay, done my best. They all say live, although Facebook now is saying starting, but the stop is blinking, so it's not clear to me whether we are live on Facebook or not. These are things I'm going to have to work out. Welcome to The Information Philosopher. I'm Bob Doyle, webcasting from my studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm hoping to reach philosophers and scientists around the world to help solve several great problems in philosophy, in physics, in biology, and in psychology. The key to finding solutions is to understand the physical, even the metaphysical nature of information. Information is a physical thing, but it's not made of material, matter, or energy. We live in the information age today, but few philosophers understand that information is neither matter nor energy. Information needs matter to be embodied, in our brains, for example, and it needs energy to be communicated, like this lecture coming over the internet. Matter and energy are conserved quantities. The total amount of matter and energy today is the same as there was at the origin of the universe 13.75 billion years ago. But if the stuff of the material world is a constant amount for all time, what accounts for the changes that we see, the new things under the sun? What's changing is information, which is not conserved. Information has been increasing since the beginning of the universe, despite the second law of thermodynamics and increasing entropy, which arguably destroy information. The changes are in the arrangement of the matter into what we call information structures, like the galaxies, stars, and planets. But living things, you and I, are dynamic and growing information structures. Living things are, in some sense, an abstract form through which matter and energy continuously flow. And it's information processing from the DNA in our cells to the thinking in our minds that controls those flows of matter and energy. I will try to argue that information is the modern spirit, the so-called ghost in the machine, the mind and the body, and it is the controversial idea of a soul. And when we die, it's our information that perishes. Only our matter remains. Well, I noticed we didn't hear my music bed, so there's another failure in our efforts. So I will have to work on that one. I'll make a note of that. But for starters, I'd like, and in the future, I hope that my lectures each day, Monday through Friday, will be on a different topic. On Mondays, I hope to talk about one or more of the great problems in philosophy, physics, biology, psychology that I've been studying, researching all the years. On Tuesday, I'll focus on one of those problems, which was the focus of my first book on free will. On Wednesday, I'm going to look at one or two of the great philosophers that I've studied and look at their research and how it applies to the things I'm doing today. On Thursday, I'll be lecturing on metaphysics, which was my third book. And on Friday, I'll be looking into the life of Albert Einstein, who I argue really contributed a great deal to quantum mechanics, even though he was widely regarded as the most severe critic of quantum mechanics, partly because he hated some of the things he discovered about it, in particular the notion of indeterminism or chance, or what Heisenberg came to call uncertainty or indeterminacy in 1927. I will show that Einstein first began to see strange phenomena that are today considered mysteries in quantum mechanics, like non-locality. And he found the idea that there was chance involved when matter interacts with radiation. And that was in 1916. More than 10 years before Heisenberg turned this notion into his uncertainty principle. So let me give you a look at my book on information on great problems and tell you why we will transition into some talk about one or more of these problems. What I'd like to do today is focus on problems having to do with the mind, like the mind-body problem. So let's take a look here at a taxonomy of the problems that I'm going to be covering with you. I hope they all fit on your screen. I think I've just barely got them tight enough. you'll see that on the left are the problems in philosophy, and that's the area we'll be talking about today. In particular, mind, the mind-body problem, which is very simply, how can an immaterial mind, if the mind has no matter aspect, because it's different from the brain and our neurons, how can an immaterial mind possibly have any causal relationship with the body and move the body? And then there are other very powerful problems, one notably called the hard problem of consciousness by David Chalmers, the Australian philosopher of mind. And we'll be looking a little at the work of David Chalmers today. Whether we have a self and how it knows anything about other minds is another particular problem in this area of the mind. And finally, there's this subject of mental causation. It's usually a negative argument that nothing mental can possibly be causing the body to do things. But we'll look at arguments about what the possibilities are for mental causation. So let me take a look at David Chalmers. Chalmers is a philosopher of mind whose characterization of consciousness as the hard problem has set a very high bar for understanding the mind. Chalmers says that the problem of quantum mechanics, something we will be working on a good deal, is almost as hard as the problem of consciousness. And some other philosophers of mind have said that the secret to understanding consciousness may be found by examining the mysteries of quantum mechanics, as if somehow consciousness depends on quantum phenomena. Now, I don't believe this, and I'll try to explain what their relationship is. As I noted, I will be studying on Friday lectures the discovery of indeterminism by Einstein has major implications for issues having to do with the way our mind works, in particular whether we're free. Now, Chalmers describes his position as a naturalistic dualism. A dualism is a really old idea that goes back even to the earliest times in philosophy, where we describe the difference between an idealism, which is purely abstract ideas. Plato famously thought that ideas were the real world, quote, real, which seems odd to us today, and that the world around us was merely the ephemeral world. It didn't have any eternal being. It had no truth. The issues he discussed, like truth, goodness, beauty, and so forth, were famously thought to be not in some other world other than the phenomenal or material world, a subject taken up 2,000 years later by Immanuel Kant. At any rate, today we talk about this notion of naturalistic dualism as an idea of physicalism. Chalmers doubts that consciousness can be explained by physical theories because consciousness, he says, is itself not physical. Okay? Now, I don't believe that much, but I partly agree with Chalmers because all of our experiences, which get recorded in our brain and reproduced, are actually stored in the brain as immaterial information. I regard the experiences as recorded, much as information is recorded in an audio or video recording machine today, especially in the digital age. It's recorded as data, digital data, which is quite abstract, bits and bytes as we think of it in the world of computers. But information, while not material, is embodied in the physical world as human knowledge. And as the experiences recorded in our mind, I have a model of the mind I call the experience recorder and reproducer. So this relationship between idealism, because ideas are immaterial information, and materialism, where the notion here is that everything in the universe everything of a substantial nature is either matter or energy. But this is a dualism. I would like to come back to that in a moment. I'm going to just remind you that the great René Descartes made an argument that the mind was a different substance from the brain or the body. And then he posed this great problem: how could the one possibly affect the other? Let me just for a moment go to my table of dualisms to show you what over the ages we've had the idea that materialism and idealism. I'll skip by some of my definitions and go to the earliest years of philosophy, in which there was much discussion about whether there was only one thing in the universe or many things. These came to be known as monism versus pluralism, or, as I like to say, the most important dualism of all time is the distinction between idealism and materialism, sometimes called having the character of being, a kind of eternal set of ideas, as being more real, as Plato thought, versus becoming, which is a highly contingent world. And so it goes, and there are many of these here, until all the way down we get to the problem of the mind and the body. Now let's see if I can get back to, here we go. Here we are, back to David Chalmers. Now, let me briefly introduce his thoughts about physicalism. Remember, Chalmers thinks that physicalism is somehow not including immaterial things, and I want to distinguish between a physicalism that's really materialism, and a physicalism which includes immaterial things like information. So let's see if we can bring up Chalmers, see if I can play him full screen, and turn on his closed captions. And we've got a problem because we have not gone back to that. Here we are. What are the problems of physicalism? Let's see if...
I think the problem of consciousness really is the most significant challenge to physicalism, and it's certainly the one I've always been the most moved by. Are there other challenges too? Yeah, there are. On the other hand, I think intentionality is difficult to explain in physical terms. On the other hand, I'm inclined to think that that difficulty is very much bound up with the difficulty of explaining consciousness. So I think once one has consciousness in the picture, then the question now is transformed. Can we explain intentionality in terms of physics and consciousness? Well, I think that's now much less clear. There will be an explanatory gap to intentionality from there, especially if you think, as I think, that consciousness already involves some intentionality. Free will, I'm not so sure about, and morals, but it's easy to think that having consciousness in the picture can help with some aspects of morality too. Maybe consciousness is the fundamental source of value, for example. So I'm inclined at least to think that, I've always found the physicalist picture attractive, and it's consciousness that's just seemed to provide a datum that just seems to cause serious problems for physicalism. I don't see other things that stick up like data from there. At the same time, we want to, if we are going to have consciousness in the picture, then we want to work towards an integrated explanation of everything. And it would be nice if irreducible consciousness plays a role in explaining many phenomena besides itself.
So let's see if I've properly paused this. It's quite a test for me to see if I can bring in a speaker like Chalmers over YouTube and on one of my screens here, and we did succeed with it. Now, I just want to point out that the jargon of physicalism and naturalism and the idea that there is nothing of the nature of an immaterial soul or spirit, ghost in the machine, as Gilbert Ryle called it, is going to be the main subject of the main goal of my work, is to establish that information has many of the characteristics of what philosophers and others have all long thought would be the characteristic of our self. In other words, our self would not be the particular molecules, the particular atoms that we're made of at this moment. My body is constantly changing the material in it because there's a flow of energy in the form of food going through my body, and matter is quite different at my age of 81 from the material Bob Doyle when I was 18. But yet we have a sense of being the same person that we were 60, 70 years ago. And what accounts for that? My view is that it is the information which has been stored in our minds. It's our learning, of course, it's our knowledge, but more than that, it's remembering experiences, a different kind of memory from memory of facts and so forth. It's a encoded set of things we know. Some of them may have been there genetically, that we all agree that many of our characteristics are shared with our parents. And humans, of course, have a very large set of behaviors, we could say, many of them even similar to those of animals, but some very distinctly human, especially this idea of knowledge outside ourselves, which we can communicate like this lecture over the internet. So what are we trying to prove here? That is that information is a special capability for processing the matter and energy flowing through our bodies. We can think of information processing as something that computers do, but in the case of all living things, the real management down at the deepest level is done by our cells and of the organization of our cells into organs. And those all have functions which have been established by biology, by biological evolution, and they come to provide us with the ability to keep ourselves alive. But that maintenance of life is something that is going on because information, whether it's the information in our DNA that now and again is asked to send out a signal to the ribosomes in our cells because a certain protein is missing in our bodies, for example, and messenger RNA is stripped off the DNA and sent out of the nucleus of a cell into this factory called a ribosome, which takes individual amino acids floating around and assembles them into a long chain, which can become a protein, or if it's properly folded, it becomes an active enzyme, and then it goes to work in our cells to keep us alive. Now that whole process is very much like a factory that's managed by robots running according to algorithms and therefore being an information processing system, much like the computers that we build today. Now, the computer analogy is not a very perfect one because biological computing is in a way more sophisticated and capable than the kind of processing we do with our computers. The reason I say that is that computers early on, and I've been working with them since 1970s, 60s, right? And in those days, our computers were limited because they often made errors. Memory was mistakenly read. Various things like electrical pulses or cosmic rays destroyed certain bits of information, and suddenly the computer didn't know what it was doing. Today, a computer has a very powerful system of error detection and correction. And that means it can overcome accidental bits being changed. And it can figure out which bit was wrong and fix it, in fact. Now, that sounds great. Our computers are very powerful and they do wonderful things, including transmitting this lecture over the internet with flawless, for the most part, pixels everywhere in the picture. But the kind of error detection and correction that went on in biology is incredibly more robust and accurate. In particular, the coding, the algorithmic information in our DNA has some parts of it which go back into the most simple forms of life, well before animals, back when there were bacteria, and back before that when the very first primitive living things were able to duplicate the information that they had, but hadn't yet formed into cells, into these oil spheres inside of which they could collect the particular nutrients they wanted to have in order to make copies of themselves. But what I'm saying is that the earliest DNA from the bacteria, the prokaryotes, and the archaea had the same DNA as parts of our DNA. So in information terms, what I'm saying is that that stretch of DNA has been free of errors. Not that there weren't a lot of errors along the way. There were undoubtedly enormous numbers, but they were detected and they were corrected. And that's for probably 3.5 billion years of carrying information forward in living things that's needed in order to maintain lives of all those organisms through billions of years. So let's then come back away from biology for a moment to the simple notion that everything is really matter, and somehow atoms, molecules obey laws that are what are called sometimes deterministic or even predetermined from earlier times. The argument that's been popular in not only in science but in philosophy for centuries is that if there are laws of nature, and if they describe the motions of the planets and things in the cosmos, surely they apply to little things like human beings and other living things. But I'm going to try to argue that there's something wrong there. So there is actually something going on very different in living things from the orderly behavior of the planets. Now, Newton famously described equations which explain how things move in the solar system. And it came to be thought of as a consequence of laws which allowed you to tell what the future will be based on a causal chain of events. The concept of events came to be really solidified in the work of Einstein and Minkowski and others on special relativity, when everything was seen in his four-dimensional view as an event in space and time, or space-time. And the picture he produced was that each event in space-time could be connected back to earlier events in earlier parts of time, where here Einstein is thinking of time as a lot like space. The events that are earlier in time are in some way similar to events that are in other locations in space. But he famously pointed out that there are events in space far from a given event at this moment. They cannot have any causal influence on the event here and now. But there's a cone, which he called the light cone, which is separated by a line, or actually a cone in space-time that separates events that can have causal influences on us from those that cannot. Then the idea was, surely whatever happened at this space and time, the here and now, is a consequence, a causal consequence completely determined by all those events that are out in our past, whose influences could have been influencing what we are doing here and now. That unfortunately is an incorrect view, because not every event is causally connected to those earlier events. Einstein discovered that the fundamental nature of physics is actually statistical. There are elements of chance in there. And so that changed a great deal about why we think things are to be explained by matter in interacting with other matter in ways that are all causal and determined. Even worse, the view is perhaps everything happening today was predetermined from the earliest times. And the notion of predeterminism came to be described most powerfully by the great French philosopher Laplace, who said, what if there was an intelligent being? Some would have compared that being to a god, an omniscient being, a super intelligent being, who could at any one moment in space and time, in modern terms, if that person, intelligent person, could know the motion, the positions and the motion, the direction of motion, the speeds of every single particle in the universe, and of course that's an impossible goal epistemologically, where would that agent store all that information? But the idea was that given all that information, that intelligent being could predict the future indefinitely, could see, as if on the mind of God, as they said, all times are equally visible to such a super intelligent being, and that being could know everything that had happened. Well, in our other lectures, we're going to make plain why it is these interesting ideas were not possible. But that was the thinking really from the earliest times in natural philosophy, when nature and the studies were part of philosophy, down to Isaac Newton, when in a way natural philosophy separated away from a kind of philosophy of ideas, and physics became a science, and that's where we are today. And those who think that that science, especially physics, which can explain chemistry and a great deal of other things because of its powerful laws, physics has become the model for how one does science. One can say that chemists certainly, biologists to a great degree, and many others, psychologists, have a kind of physics envy. They wish that they could come up with the laws which describe how the mind works, and everything else down through our biological systems, they hope could be understood in terms of laws of nature. That is possible then is the fundamental idea underlying naturalism and the idea of physicalism. So let's go on to another physicalist for just a moment, and let me switch to a fellow named Jae-Gwon Kim. Jae-Gwon Kim is a philosopher of mind, and he's just about my age, has been a professor at Brown University. I graduated from Brown. Jae-Gwon Kim graduated from Dartmouth, same year I graduated from Brown, back in 1958. So we're contemporaries. Now, Kim has spent many years working on the mind-body problem, which is subject of most of our lecture today, and this related problem of mental causation. He's also critically examined the concept of supervenience, that the mind is just something that supervenes, rides on top of the brain. It was first introduced, this concept of the mind sort of riding on top of the brain, in the study of emergence, that some emergent properties or laws in some higher level of a hierarchy, imagine the mind at the top of this hierarchy, could give them some downward causal control over the properties or laws of lower levels. Now, Kim accepts the idea of physicalism, which for him means that the world consists solely of material particles, and they're subject to the known laws of physics, as we've been discussing. So I think that Kim's physicalism is more properly a pure materialism. And for many thinkers, this physicalism or materialism implies the concept of reductionism. Now, reductionism is the idea that all phenomena are reducible to physics, that somehow chemistry should be considered totally explainable by physics, and it has largely been reduced to physics. So although some properties of even simple molecules like water are generally not predictable from the properties of the component hydrogen and oxygen atoms, an idea first pointed out by John Stuart Mill hundreds of years ago. But like many philosophers and even many scientists who are not physicalists, Kim accepts the pre-quantum, I point out, physics idea that all the events in the world form a causal chain. Each event is causally controlled by the earlier events. And this causal closure then introduced him, makes him argue that what would we possibly be able to do if we tried to get beyond a physicalist picture? He says, quote, "Leaving physicalism behind is to abandon ontological physicalism." Sounds so profound. The view that bits of matter and their aggregates in space-time exhaust the contents of the world. There is nothing in the world but matter. This means, he says, that one would be embracing an ontology that posits entities other than material substances, that is, immaterial minds or souls outside physical space with immaterial, non-physical properties. Now let me for a moment switch to another page I think I have here on Jaegwon Kim. Here he is. Yes. I have to do this with my mouse, and I'll go to the bio. When I go to this view, there are some more things I can do. You can see my mouse controlling, and I just want to point out these amazing ideas that he thinks happen. To me, the ancient idea that there is something immaterial going on, and that it's been thought of as a mind or a soul, something spiritual, the ghost in the machine, as Gilbert Ryle called it. Those ideas are widely mocked among scientists. The notion that there's something else to us as a self. And the only worrisome thing about it, I think, for most scientists who are secularists, is that this soul or mind or ghost in the machine might survive the death of the organism. So what my work is going to do, I hope I will be able to convince you, is that we have souls, we have mind, we have a notion of a ghost or a spirit in ourselves, and that is not a material thing. So the good news is that I really think I can convince you that it is the abstract information that's in all our experiences that provides us with this notion of an immaterial part to us, but that immaterial part in no way survives our death. When our bodies cease to operate, the matter that we're composed of at that moment definitely remains, but the information that was embodied in that matter is very definitely lost. So it turns out that Kim was thinking about ideas that had been proposed by the philosopher Donald Davidson, and I could go to his page for just a moment, but it's rather complicated, and I want to just go down. As with every one of my philosophers, there's a great deal of information on all these pages. I want to go to Davidson's work in 1970 on the idea of mental events. Now, Davidson was on the track of something, but unfortunately, what he did with it is to assume that there were events, like the space-time events that physics was reduced to, going on in the mind. And I'm going to try to argue that our mentality and what goes on in the use of the information in our brains as our knowledge and our experiences, and how it is all of that in the mind forms our thoughts, and how our thoughts actually lead us to actions which are usually adequately determined by our reasons and our motives and feelings and so forth, but some of the thoughts we have are not determined by anything that happened earlier. So he describes a lot here, and I wanted to focus on some ideas here. He claimed the following three things about his mental events, and I think I've got a quote here to bring him up. In order to allow mental events to cause physical events, yet not be reducible to them, not be just giving us the illusion of a mind, but the actual mind playing a role in the world, he developed these 3 points. First, at least some mental events interact causally with physical events. Second, where there is causality, there must be a law. And here's, of course, a serious problem with Davidson's work, because the laws may not be deterministic laws. They may be statistical laws. And he instead goes on here in his point number 2, that events related as cause and effect must fall under strict deterministic laws. This shows that Davidson was suffering from this physics envy that I mentioned. So, however, he brings up point 3. There are no strict deterministic laws on the basis of which mental events can be predicted and explained. And he came to call mental events anomalous. And so we're back to Jaegwon Kim, and here it says he investigated the work of Donald Davidson and his ideas on mental events. And I recap a little bit of Davidson's arguments here on Kim's page. But at the end of the day, Kim came up with an argument in his presidential address to the American Philosophical Association, in which he described the notion of some mentality supervening or riding above the physical part of the brain or the material part of the brain, right? He said, let's say there are mental events M1 and another mental event M2. And the argument is that since M1 simply supervenes on something in the brain, so the mind thinking supervenes on something the brain is doing in its materiality, since the physical event 1 is what causes the physical event 2, and here's a mistake in my page, which I will correct, he then argued that by causal closure of the physical world, the mental events are superfluous. They must be excluded in his book, Physicalism, or something is near enough. So that's basically the picture we have from Jaegwon Kim. And let me go back now to the idea of this mental and physical dualism, because it would appear that what Davidson is trying to do is to argue that there's a mental realm which is not the same as the physical realm or the material realm. And what Chalmers does, we go back to Chalmers for a moment, and I'll just scroll down to where he describes his work. Chalmers thinks correctly. I'm reading from that paragraph on the left of the little video I'm about to show, that the dualism is not a substance dualism, as René Descartes gets most of the credit for, even though the idea of a dualism has been around a lot longer than Descartes. So Chalmers says, let's not think of the mental aspect or the consciousness aspect as matter and material, or not, the same substantiality as matter. And so the dualism is not a substance dualism. The mental aspect is not another substance, but instead is just a property of the matter. And let's hear what Chalmers says about this. And I'll try to turn on the subtitles. And are we playing?
Subject had better be derivative from there, and then that, I think, would not be seen as a dualism of substances.
Looks like I've popped way into the latter part of it. Let's try to start that again.
If one's going to be a dualist, the two most famous forms of dualism are dualism of substances and a dualism of properties. I tend to stay away from talk about substances here, partly because I don't know exactly what substances are supposed to be. But to me, I think the biggest issue is near here is, does one need irreducible properties, or does one also need irreducible particulars? So at the very least, I think one needs new and fundamental properties of conscious experience. Does one also need a new and fundamental subject of experience to bear those properties? And I don't know the answer to that question. So in my book, The Conscious Mind, I argued for property dualism, not excluding dualism of particulars or substances, just because that's where the arguments go. I think this can be combined with views where there are, I think if you're going to be a classical dualist, I think it makes most sense probably to have an irreducible particular. If, on the other hand, you're going to be a panpsychist, then I think you'll have fundamental physical particulars with fundamental phenomenal properties, and subjects had better be derivative from there. And then that, I think, would not be seen as a dualism of substances, at best of properties.
So what we're hearing from Chalmers is that he accepts the notion that perhaps the mental side of the classical dualism, the ideal side, is just a property, and there's a reasonable argument to be made that this is correct, that when matter is arranged into a particular positions for all atoms in a complex thing, even as complex a thing as an organism, that arrangement is information. And if that information is of a certain type, it is a property of that material thing that that information can help manage that thing, keep it alive, for example, or be the kind of thing we're thinking about, because we have an arrangement of our synapses in our neurons that carry that idea. But the idea itself is not the matter, the brain, but simply the arrangement of the way the brain has become, because it's recorded its past experiences, which makes us into an organism that has some things we've formed for genetic reasons, because like all animals or all living things, we've come to be the way we are because biology, development, growth makes us what we are. But then, as human beings especially, we have experiences, the effects of the environment as other things, as everyone says, the nurture aspect rather than the nature aspect of an animal or a human being, which gives us knowledge and makes us what we are. And our brain allows us to think about things which are themselves not completely determined by the physical particles themselves. So let me break away from my great problems, but let me just take another quick look at it and point out that next Monday we'll come back to some of these topics, and we're touched on what is the mind. Is it just the brain? Many psychology books argue that that's all the mind is. It is the brain. And then the mind-body problem, if we decide to imagine the mind to be something different from the body. And this hard problem of consciousness, a hard problem as David Chalmers describes it. Now, in the course of our other lectures, I'd just like to say that we have here topics, deep topics like metaphysics and free will. Now, I've written books about both of these, and my first book was a book on free will. I'll give you a quick look at it. This book will be the subject of Tuesday lectures, so tomorrow when you come in, we'll try to introduce some aspects of this problem, which I call a scandal for a very simple reason. I basically think that it's a shame that academic professors are teaching the idea of determinism as in control of what we are doing, that we're all, as the Calvinist view, that everything that happens is something that happens to us, not something that we make and bring into happening. And I do not think it's a really good idea for teaching young people that they are somehow automatons. I would rather teach them that they are creative, and I say here that the scandal is that academic philosophers are convincing many young students that they are biological machines, that their brains are computers, they have no mind, and their actions are therefore completely determined. And to end this scandal, something I try to do in this book, is to encourage philosophers to teach a two-stage model of free will and creativity, where the first stage introduces an indeterminism that prevents us from being predetermined from the earliest time in the universe. So in addition to that, my third book was to study the wonderfully interesting and maybe kind of ancient problems and paradoxes and puzzles that have been identified as metaphysical. And it was in a way sad that the whole 20th century was a time for making fun of metaphysics. It was a time for denying the existence of a mind. The behaviorist famously said there are nothing but brains, there are human beings, but we can't see the mind, we can't observe the mind, we can't measure anything in the mind. As far as behaviorism is concerned, the mind is a black box, and they argued we should just focus on describing our behaviors, which are indeed observable. And so in the 20th century, mind was serious, not thought to be a serious subject for academic researchers. That's changed with the development of neuroscience especially, but it's ironic that the neuroscientists even more so are thinking they will be able to explain everything by studying the neurons themselves. I don't think they'll ever see the information organization, or at least not for the foreseeable future. So my metaphysics book will be the subject of lectures on Thursdays. On Wednesdays, I will hope to come to talk about those many philosophers that I have on my web pages. So take a quick look at that over here on my bio. And you'll see that on the right-hand side, the left-hand side of the page, I have this enormously long list of people I've studied, and we're sort of in the middle of it here. But in each case, I have written very long pages. Some of them are almost book length, especially the work on Einstein. And I want to introduce you to my website as a place for you to go and learn about the great contributions to knowledge that people have made in the past, some of them living today, and so they're still active researchers. When I write a page on someone, here's Mark Balaguer, who wrote a book on free will recently, published by MIT Press. You'll see a summary of his ideas on my page and how it is I think he fits into modern thinking. So my website means to provide a set of resources for you which goes very, very deep. I not only want to give a summary of the work, which I believe complements what's done on the Wikipedia, where you get all the basic biography, when the person was born and where he went to school, where he worked, and so forth. But on my pages, here's William James, for example, who's going to be an important part of our Tuesday lectures, I provide not only substantial quotes out of his work, alongside my attempts to analyze what he did and explain that to you, but I also have gone out of my way to locate the articles which he wrote in his time, which typical layperson anyway would not be able to find. And I've made PDFs of those articles. This is perhaps the most important one we'll be discussing tomorrow, something he wrote in 1884. And here is that article. So I put a summary of anchors or points in the article that you can jump to by hitting these links, but otherwise these are the words of William James. So you can know as much about him as if you had an academic position and access to his books in your library, as I do, or his articles in the journals, which I do. So I'm going to provide those to you on my website. Okay, well, we have just a few minutes left, and I'd like to say that besides my website and all of my books, these lectures, I hope, will be able to reach out to students or other philosophers and scientists who are interested in the problems I'm discussing, and get all of us to discuss and criticize ways of thinking about philosophical problems and scientific problems by adding in this new sense that thinking about them in terms of the information architecture, the information structure in whatever it is we're discussing can give us a deeper and more precise understanding of something, a phenomenon, than you get by talking about it with words. The 20th century philosophy, which rejected the mind and called a lot of such things metaphysical, was a time when philosophers thought they could get to deep truths with the use of logic. Famously, Bertrand Russell and his young Wittgenstein student or colleague developed this notion initially of logical positivism, where positivism was an idea that one should only study things that you can observe. And this is a really good idea. It has a lot to do with modern quantum mechanics, which talks about, quote, observables. The behaviorists argued they should study behaviors, and that was a very powerful form of positivism. But the notion of logical positivism fell apart rather rapidly in the early 20th century, and called logical empiricism by the Vienna Circle in Europe, which was attended by Wittgenstein, and led him to the view that building from logical atomic truths and building up a picture of logical molecules or sentences out of these fundamental ideas that could be expressed in words or logic was a mistake, a terrible mistake, and that language is such an ambiguous thing that he argued you really couldn't get to these, the ends that they thought they could. And Wittgenstein famously switched around to an idea that there's a great deal of relativity and ambiguity in the use of words. And his famous later works moved over to this view, which some modern philosophers suggest that we should be doing literary criticism, like Richard Rorty, for example, rather than trying to know deep things about reality, especially quantum reality, which layered on a large amount of difficulty for those working to understand the world. So, positivism failed, and analytical language philosophy failed to solve a problem. They famously said they would perhaps settle for dissolving or dissolving a problem. That got some pushback from Karl Popper, famous debate with Wittgenstein concerning whether these puzzles and paradoxes were only puzzles to be dissolved, or whether they were real problems which ought to be understood by scientific methods. And I think Popper had, in the end of the day, the upper hand on that argument, although today much of his work went a little too far in thinking he could explain quantum mechanics, which remains a very difficult subject. So the 4 lectures: Monday, Problems in Philosophy; Tuesday, Free Will and its History; Wednesday, we'll talk to or about and play back from video where they're living philosophers. We'll study specific philosophers. Thursday, we'll jump into those metaphysics problems. And Friday, we'll study the life of Albert Einstein, which is my 4th book. I'm halfway through, and it looks like this. And I can direct you to the website, my Information Philosopher website, where I have put all these work in my books online as PDFs, so you can download them free. You don't have to buy them at all. Okay, I think we're going to stop here for Monday. It's now November 13th, and this is a trial run for lectures that I hope to give every weekday between 3 and 4 on YouTube and Facebook. Thank you. Didn't even close that door. Stopping.